The silence of the stairwell was its own kind of music. It was a hollow, resonant quiet that soaked up the ambient noise of the city outside and the muffled thrum of the building's life support. Most residents of the Eclipse Tower used the elevators, sleek chrome boxes that whisked them up to their hermetically sealed lives with a polite, synthetic chime. But I preferred the stairs. Down here, between the concrete walls and the cold steel rail, the building felt real. It breathed. It had a pulse I could feel through the soles of my shoes. For 3 months, this had been my secret place. My apartment on the 22nd floor was a monument to minimalist design and emotional sterility. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows showing a city I felt no connection to, and furniture that looked better than it felt. It was a place to exist, not to live. So, I came here, to Stairwell B, usually after midnight, when the chances of encountering another soul were practically zero. I would sit on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floors, a forgotten zone below the main residential block, and just listen. Sometimes I'd bring a sketchbook, the scratching of charcoal on paper the only sound I'd make for hours. It was a small, harmless act of rebellion, a way of claiming a piece of this monolithic building for myself. I was a ghost in my own life, a quiet observer paying exorbitant rent to feel invisible. Here, in the echoing dark, my invisibility felt like a choice, a superpower. It felt like peace. That night, the peace shattered. I was leaning against the cool concrete, my eyes closed, tracing the path of a distant siren as it faded into the urban hum. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paint. I was so lost in the sensory details of my hiding spot that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost on top of me. My eyes snapped open. The heavy fire door on the 4th floor landing groaned open, spilling a harsh rectangle of fluorescent light onto the steps below. A figure stood silhouetted against it. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I'd been caught. All I could think of were the litany of complaints from the building's online message board. Loitering, suspicious individuals, noise complaints about the most mundane things. I was about to become one of them, a cautionary tale for the other tenants. The figure stepped through the doorway, letting the heavy door swing shut with a deep, definitive thud that echoed all the way down the shaft. The emergency light on the landing flickered on, casting him in a pale, ghostly green. He wasn't one of the tenants. He wore a simple dark blue uniform, the kind that was meant to look official without being threatening. Security. But he was nothing like the usual night watchman, a man in his late 60s with a kind smile and a sleepy gait. This man was younger, maybe in his early 30s. He was built like a part of the building itself, solid, immovable. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there on the landing above me, looking down. His presence filled the space, shrinking my little sanctuary until I felt pinned against the wall. I couldn't make out his features clearly in the dim light, only the strong line of his jaw and the breadth of his shoulders. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with my own anxiety. I should say something. I should explain. But my throat was tight, the words trapped behind a wall of panic. Finally, he moved, descending the steps with a slow, deliberate tread. His boots made soft, rhythmic sounds on the concrete. Each step was a drumbeat counting down to my inevitable eviction from my own life. He stopped on the step just above my landing, close enough now that I could see his face. He had dark eyes that seemed to absorb the weak light, giving nothing away. His expression was neutral, unreadable. There was a faint scent about him, something clean like industrial soap mixed with the faint, warm smell of coffee. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was low and calm, a gravelly rumble that didn't echo the way my own frantic breathing did. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "I know. I'm sorry. I was just thinking." It sounded pathetic, even to my own ears. A grown man, hiding in a stairwell to think. He didn't respond. He just watched me, his head tilted slightly. That steady gaze was unnerving. It felt like he was seeing more than just a guy breaking the building rules. It felt like he was cataloging me, taking in my slightly too expensive jeans, my worn-out art school sweatshirt, the nervous way I was picking at a loose thread on my sleeve. I felt exposed, stripped bare under that quiet scrutiny. "It's after 2 in the morning," he continued, his tone unchanged. "Most people think in their apartments." "I'm not most people," I mumbled, a flicker of defiance I hadn't expected. A corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not really. It was too small, too fleeting. But it was a crack in his stoic facade. "I've noticed," he said. "This isn't the first time. I've seen you on the cameras. Tuesday, Friday last week. You like this spot." My blood ran cold. He'd been watching me. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and, in a strange, unwelcome way, thrilling. My secret place hadn't been a secret at all. My invisibility was an illusion. Someone had been watching my quiet rebellion all along. I had been seen. "I'm not doing anything wrong," I said, my voice a little stronger now. "I'm not making noise. I'm not damaging property." "You're loitering in a restricted area," he countered, the professionalism back in his voice. "It's a security risk. I could write you up. Management would send you a formal warning. Maybe a fine." I braced myself. This was it. The official reprimand. The black mark on my perfect tenant record. My stomach churned. "Okay," I said, my shoulders slumping in defeat. "Write me up." He was silent for another long moment. I watched as his dark eyes scanned the small space, taking in the scuffed walls, the dusty railing, my sketchbook lying forgotten on the concrete beside me. His gaze lingered on the book before returning to my face. "No," he said, the single word cutting through the tense air. "I don't think I'll do that." Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. "Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll go back to my apartment." "It won't happen again." I started to gather myself, ready to flee. "I didn't say that," he said, and his voice held me in place more effectively than any physical restraint. "It will happen again. But not like this." He took the final step down onto my landing. He was taller than I'd realized, and I had to crane my neck slightly to look up at him. The proximity was overwhelming. I could feel a faint warmth radiating from him, could more clearly smell that clean, coffee-tinged scent. "I don't understand," I whispered. "You want to haunt the building's forgotten corners? Fine," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "But you'll do it with me. I have a problem with unauthorized personnel in my stairwells. It's messy. So, for the next week, you're going to be my authorized personnel. My punishment for you is that you're going to help me with my rounds. Every night, midnight to 4-inch. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Of all the things I had expected, this was not one of them. It was absurd. A punishment that involved spending more time in the very places I was being punished for being in. It made no sense. You're joking," I stammered. "I don't joke," he said, and his expression was so serious, so utterly devoid of humor, that I believed him instantly. "You see this building as your personal sanctuary. I see it as a collection of potential problems. A leaking pipe in the sub-basement. A jammed fire door on the roof. A flickering light in a service corridor. For the next week, you're going to see it my way. You'll see the whole thing. All its secrets." He gestured with his head back towards the fourth-floor door. "Come on. Your punishment starts now." I was too stunned to argue. I picked up my sketchbook, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected from my brain. I followed him, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and a strange, prickling anticipation. He held the heavy door open for me, and as I passed by him, my shoulder brushed against his arm. It was a brief, insignificant contact, but it felt like an electric shock. His arm was hard, solid muscle beneath the thin fabric of his uniform shirt. He led me not to the main hallway, but through a door marked service access only. We were plunged into a narrow, dimly lit corridor lined with pipes and conduits. The air was warmer here, humming with the building's mechanical heartbeat. This was the world behind the curtain, the guts of the machine. This was my punishment, and for some reason I couldn't yet understand. It felt less like a sentence and more like an invitation. The first night was an exercise in silent observation. His name, I learned from the plastic tag on his shirt, was Alex. He didn't offer it, and I didn't ask. I just saw it glinting in the low light as we walked. He moved with an economy of motion that was captivating to watch. He had a way of walking that was almost silent, his weight balanced perfectly, his senses seemingly attuned to every creak and groan of the building around us. We started in the sub-basement, a cavernous space filled with the roar of boilers and the rhythmic clanking of machinery. The air was hot and thick with the smell of oil and ozone. Alex walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the complex network of pipes and gauges. He carried a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp, white cone through the dusty air, but he barely seemed to need it. He navigated the labyrinthine space as if he could see in the dark. I followed a few steps behind him, feeling clumsy and out of place. My world was one of color palettes and composition, of quiet contemplation. This was a world of pressure valves and circuit breakers, of raw, functional power. I watched him run a hand over a large pipe, his expression thoughtful, as if he were listening to its vibrations. He was a part of this place in a way I never could be. I was a tourist, he was a native. My role in this strange punishment was unclear. I was just there, a shadow trailing a shadow. He didn't ask me to do anything. He rarely even looked at me, but I felt his awareness of me in the space. He always seemed to know exactly where I was, pausing to let me catch up, angling his body slightly to ensure a path was clear for me. After the basement, we moved upwards, floor by floor, through more service corridors. These were the veins of the building, hidden behind the pristine white walls of the residential hallways. We checked fuse boxes, emergency exits, and water mains. It was tedious, methodical work, and yet, I found myself completely engrossed, not in the tasks themselves, but in watching him perform them. I am an observer by nature. My art depends on it. I notice the way light falls on a face, the subtle shift in posture that betrays an emotion, the texture of a peeling paint chip, and I turned that intense focus on Alex. I studied the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined a pressure gauge. I watched the efficient, confident movement of his hands as he tested a door lock. I noticed the small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in his otherwise stoic face. He didn't talk much. The silence between us was vast, filled only by the hum of the building and the sound of our footsteps. When he did speak, it was brief and functional. "Watch your step here, duck your head, hand me that wrench." I would comply wordlessly, my fingers tingling when they brushed against his as I passed him the tool. Each accidental touch felt significant, a tiny spark in the deep silence. My mind would snag on the moment, replaying the brief contact, the warmth of his skin, the calloused texture of his palm. I started to analyze his micro-expressions, trying to read the unreadable. A slight tightening of his jaw when we found a propped open fire door. The barest hint of a softening around his eyes when he paused to look out a grimy service window at the sleeping city. I was trying to decipher him, to understand the logic behind his bizarre punishment. Was he just a lonely guy who wanted company? Was he trying to scare me straight? Or was this some kind of strange power play? My internal monologue was a frantic, looping conversation with myself. He looked at you for a full 3 seconds then. What does that mean? Nothing. It means nothing. He's just checking to see if you're still there. But the way his eyes lingered. Stop it. You're projecting. This is a guy doing his job, and you're a weirdo he caught in a stairwell. On the second night, something shifted. We were in a long, dark storage corridor on one of the commercial floors. The lights were on a motion sensor that had long since broken, so the only illumination came from Alex's flashlight. He was checking the sprinkler system heads, moving down the long aisle of forgotten office furniture and boxes of old files. I was standing near the entrance, trying to stay out of his way, when my foot caught on a loose floor tile. I stumbled, my arms flailing for balance in the dark. I let out a startled yelp as I pitched forward, bracing for an undignified collision with a stack of dusty cardboard boxes. But I never hit them. An arm shot out and wrapped around my waist, strong and unyielding. I was pulled back against a solid chest. My back was flush against him, my head tucked just under his chin. The air was knocked out of my lungs, but not from the near fall. It was the sudden, shocking intimacy of the contact. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my shoulder blades. His breath was warm on the back of my neck. The hand on my waist held me firm, his fingers splayed against my stomach. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to shrink to this single point of contact. My entire body was humming with a strange energy, a mix of adrenaline and something else, something I didn't dare name. The smell of him was stronger now, soap and coffee and the clean, masculine scent of his skin. It was overwhelming. Then, just as quickly as it happened, it was over. He released me and took a step back. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. The beam of his flashlight was pointed at the floor, illuminating the offending tile. "Yeah," I croaked, my voice sounding shaky and unfamiliar. "Fine. Thanks." I felt a ridiculous blush creeping up my neck. I was grateful for the darkness that hid it from him. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and went back to checking the sprinklers. But the space between us felt different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the memory of that brief, solid contact. My skin still tingled where his hand had been. I could still feel the phantom pressure of his chest against my back. He had touched me. It was an accident, a reflex, a purely functional act to stop me from falling. My logical brain knew that. But the rest of me, the lonely, observant part of me that had been starving for connection, saw it as something more. It was a meaningful touch, a crack in the wall between us. And my overthinking mind seized upon it, analyzing it from every angle, searching for a meaning I was desperate to find. The rest of the night passed in a blur of heightened awareness. Every time he got close, the fine hairs on my arms would stand up. I watched his hands, remembering the strength in them, the way they had felt holding me. The punishment was changing. It was becoming less of a chore and more of a strange, clandestine ritual. Our own secret world, hidden in the bones of the building while everyone else slept. We ended the shift on the roof. The door opened onto a flat, gravel-covered expanse, surrounded by a high parapet. The city spread out below us, a glittering tapestry of lights under a sky just beginning to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple. The wind was cool and carried the distant sounds of traffic and the faint, salty smell of the harbor. Alex walked to the edge and leaned against the parapet, his back to me. He stood there for a long time, just looking out at the skyline. I stayed by the door, unsure if I was supposed to follow. It felt like a private moment. "You can come over," he said, without turning around. "The view is the only perk of this job." I walked over and stood beside him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. The view was breathtaking. From up here, the city looked peaceful, orderly. All the chaos and noise was smoothed out into a beautiful, silent pattern. "It's amazing," I said, my voice quiet. "Yeah," he said. We stood in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the first hints of dawn color the eastern sky. The shared experience felt intimate. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, functional interactions of the past few hours. "Why are you really doing this?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "This whole punishment thing. It doesn't make any sense." He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. He turned his head and looked at me, his dark eyes catching the pre-dawn light. For the first time, his expression wasn't unreadable. There was something in it. Curiosity? Weariness? I couldn't be sure. "You looked like you needed a place to be," he said simply. His voice was soft, stripped of its official authority. And I had plenty of places. The honesty of his answer stunned me. It wasn't about rules or security or power. It was about him seeing something in me. He saw my loneliness, my need to escape, and instead of punishing it, he had accommodated it. He had folded my secret into his own. A moment of softness, a moment of vulnerability. And in that moment, I realized my analysis had been all wrong. I'd been trying to figure out his angle, his motivation, as if he were a problem to be solved. But maybe he was just a person who worked a lonely job and understood, on some fundamental level, what it felt like to be a ghost in a building full of people. The third night, the dynamic between us was irrevocably altered. The silence was no longer a void I tried to fill with my own anxious thoughts. It was a shared space, a comfortable blanket. We fell into an easy rhythm, moving through the building's hidden pathways like partners in a slow, silent dance. He'd point with his flashlight, and I'd know he wanted me to check the latch on a service panel. I'd hold the light for him while he worked, my hand steady, my focus entirely on him. We found a small leak in a utility closet on the 14th floor. It was a slow, steady drip from a rusted joint, forming a dark puddle on the concrete floor. "Damn it," Alex muttered, the first flicker of genuine annoyance I'd seen from him. Knew this joint was going to go. He set down his flashlight and opened a nearby locker, pulling out a large wrench and a bucket. "Main shutoff for this line is 3 floors down," he said, more to himself than to me. "This is going to be a mess to clean up. Is there anything I can do?" I asked, feeling a sudden urge to be useful, to be more than just a spectator in his world. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He seemed to consider it for a moment. "Yeah, actually, the shutoff valve is behind a maintenance panel. It's heavy. I could use a hand getting it open. It was a simple request, but it felt like a promotion. I was being invited in, given a real task. We took a rattling freight elevator down to the 11th floor. He led me to an unmarked metal door on the wall. "It's behind here," he said, pointing to a small, recessed handle. "It sticks. We'll have to pull together." We positioned ourselves on either side of the panel. "On three," he said. "1, 2, 3. We both heaved. The panel groaned in protest, metal scraping against rusted metal. I put all my weight into it, my muscles straining. For a moment, it didn't budge. I glanced at Alex. His jaw was clenched, his bicep taut under the sleeve of his shirt. He was close enough that I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his temple. He caught my eye and gave a short, sharp nod. We pulled again, in unison this time, a shared surge of effort. With a final, tortured screech, the panel swung open. We stumbled back a step, breathing heavily. A wave of cool, musty air washed over us from the dark space behind the wall. "Thanks," he said, his breathing slightly ragged. He gave me a small, genuine smile. It transformed his face, erasing the stoic lines and revealing a warmth I hadn't seen before. It made my stomach do a strange little flip. "No problem," I managed to say, my own voice a little breathless. He squeezed into the crawl space, the beam of his light disappearing into the darkness. I could hear him grunting and the sound of metal turning. I stood guard by the open panel, feeling a ridiculous sense of pride. We were a team. We had solved a problem together. It was a small thing, a leaky pipe in a forgotten closet, but it felt monumental. It was a shared experience that had solidified the fragile connection between us. When he emerged a few minutes later, there was a smudge of grease on his cheek. Without thinking, I reached out and wiped it away with my thumb. My thumb brushed against the slight stubble on his jaw, the skin warm and rough. I froze. My hand was still hovering in the air between us. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, something you do for a friend, a lover, not for your building's security guard who is punishing you for loitering. The silence in the corridor was suddenly deafening. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. What did I just do? My brain screamed, "Abort! Abort!" But Alex didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, his dark eyes fixed on mine. His gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second, then back up to my eyes. The air crackled. The space between us was so charged it felt like I could see it, a visible shimmer of unspoken tension. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a heavy, frantic rhythm. This is it. This is the moment where everything changes. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. He opened his mouth to say something, but just then, his radio crackled to life, a burst of static and a tinny voice shattering the moment. "Alex, you there? Got a noise complaint on 27. Over." Alex blinked, as if waking from a dream. He took a half-step back, breaking the spell. He raised the radio to his mouth, his movements seeming stiff and overly deliberate. "Yeah, copy that." On my way, he clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at me, his professional mask slipping back into place, but not quite fitting right. The corners were frayed. We should go," he said, his voice sounding rougher than usual. "Yeah," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. "Okay." We rode the elevator up to the 27th floor in a silence that was heavier and more loaded than any that had come before. I was acutely aware of him standing next to me in the small space. I stared determinately at the floor numbers as they lit up, replaying the moment in the corridor over and over in my head. The feel of his skin under my thumb. The look in his eyes. The way he had been about to speak. What had he been about to say? The noise complaint turned out to be a loud party. Alex handled it with his usual calm authority, his voice firm but polite as he spoke to a group of drunk 20-somethings. I stood back in the hallway, feeling like an awkward appendage. As we walked away, the partygoers now suitably chastened, the tension between us slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a lingering awkwardness. We finished the rest of the shift without incident, the conversation limited to functional necessities. But something had been broken open, the possibility of something more. It hung in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. The week of my punishment drew to a close. Each night felt more charged than the last. The accidental brushes of our hands as we passed in narrow corridors no longer felt entirely accidental. The long silences were no longer just comfortable. They were filled with a humming, unresolved tension. I found myself living for the nights, for those 4 hours spent in the hidden world of the building with him. My sterile apartment felt even emptier, the daylight hours a gray, tedious waiting period. I was falling for him. The realization didn't hit me like a lightning bolt. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was in the way my stomach fluttered when he gave me that rare, small smile. It was in the way I found myself sketching his profile from memory in my sketchbook, trying to capture the steady line of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. It was in the profound, aching disappointment I felt when I thought about this week ending, about going back to my solitary existence. On the last night, the air was thick with unspoken finality. We did the rounds with a heavy sort of slowness, as if both of us were trying to draw out the time. We checked the same doors, walked the same corridors, but it all felt different. It felt like a goodbye tour. Instead of ending the night on the roof, Alex led me to the security office in the lobby. It was a small, windowless room, dominated by a bank of monitors showing silent, black and white feeds from around the building. One of the screens showed the empty landing in Stairwell B, my former sanctuary. There was a desk with a cluttered computer, a beat-up coffee maker, and 2 worn-out office chairs. The air smelled strongly of coffee and something vaguely electric. This was the backroom, the place where my punishment had officially begun, and where, I assumed, it was about to officially end. Alex didn't turn on the main overhead light, leaving the room illuminated only by the cold, flickering glow of the monitors. He walked over to the coffee maker and poured the last of a stale pot into a ceramic mug. He didn't offer me any. He leaned against the desk, cradling the warm mug in his hands, and looked at me. "Well," he said, his voice quiet. "That's it. 7 nights. Your sentence is served." My heart sank. It sounded so final. So clinical. "Right?" I said, trying to keep my voice even. I shoved my hands in my pockets, unsure what to do with them. "So, I guess I'll see you around." It was a weak, pointless thing to say. I would never see him. He was a creature of the night, and I was about to be banished back to the world of the day. "You going to go back to hiding in the stairwell?" he asked. His eyes were shadowed, the light from the monitors creating shifting patterns on his face. The question was casual, but it felt loaded, a test. I thought about it. The idea of going back to that cold, empty landing by myself. Now that I knew he was watching, now that I knew him, it felt unbearable. It wouldn't be a sanctuary anymore. It would just be a reminder of this week, of him. "I don't know," I said, and it was the honest truth. "I guess I don't have a reason to be down there anymore." My subtext was screaming, "Give me a reason. Give me another reason to see you." He was silent. He just stared at me over the rim of his coffee mug. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the computer fans. The silence stretched, pulling taut between us like a wire. This was the tipping point. The moment where we either walked away and let this strange week become a weird memory, or something else. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't let it end like this. The fear of rejection was a cold knot in my stomach, but the fear of walking out that door and never speaking to him again was worse. "Alex," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He lowered the mug, his eyes never leaving my face. The words tumbled out of me, clumsy and raw. "I don't want it to be over." It was a confession, a plea. I laid my cards on the table, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. I watched his face, searching for any sign of rejection, of pity, of disgust. He set the mug down on the desk with a soft click. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. He pushed himself off the desk and took a step towards me. Then another. He stopped when there was barely a foot of space between us. The glow from the monitors illuminated the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Julian," he said, and the sound of my own name on his lips was devastatingly intimate. "You were never being punished." My breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He was so close. I could feel the heat coming off his body, see the slight parting of his lips. The air was thick, heavy, electric. "I am here. This is real." My mind went quiet, all the frantic analysis and overthinking silenced by the sheer, overwhelming presence of him. He raised a hand, slowly, as if not to startle me. He didn't touch my face. Instead, his fingers gently brushed against the collar of my sweatshirt, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes searched mine, a silent question. I gave him a barely perceptible nod. That was all the permission he needed. He closed the remaining distance between us. His other hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin behind my ear, and my eyes fluttered shut. And then his lips met mine. It wasn't a hard, demanding kiss. It was soft. It was questioning. It was hesitant at first, a gentle pressure, a testing of the waters. I responded instantly, leaning into him, my hands coming up to rest on his chest. I could feel the solid muscle there, the steady, strong beat of his heart under my palm. It was beating just as fast as mine. The kiss deepened. It was a slow, deliberate exploration. It was the taste of stale coffee and something uniquely him. It was the rough scrape of his stubble against my skin. It was the feeling of his hand tightening at the back of my neck, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely nights and unspoken things, of quiet observation and a connection forged in the secret, silent places of the world. It was not rushed. It was not hungry. It was right. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. I could feel his warm breath on my lips. My hands were still flat against his chest, clinging to him as if I were afraid he might disappear. "Julian," he whispered again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. There were no words for the relief, the terror, the soaring, brilliant hope that was flooding through me. So I just stood there, in the flickering light of the security monitors, my forehead pressed against his, breathing him in. The punishment was over, and something new, something fragile and terrifying and beautiful, was just beginning. He walked me to the elevator. We didn't hold hands. We didn't speak. The silence that fell between us now was different yet again. It was a dazed, fragile thing, full of the echo of what had just happened in that small, windowless room. When the elevator doors chimed open, I stepped inside, my body feeling strangely light, disconnected. I turned to face him. He was standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression once again unreadable in the harsh light of the lobby. But his eyes were fixed on me, and they were full of a raw vulnerability that mirrored my own. "See you," he said, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, the word feeling inadequate. The door slid shut, cutting him off from my view. I rode the elevator up to the 22nd floor in a state of suspended animation. My lips still tingled. I could still feel the phantom sensation of his hand at the back of my neck. I fumbled with my keys, let myself into my dark, silent apartment, and leaned back against the door, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep. How could I? I paced the length of my living room, the city lights outside seeming brighter, sharper. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting every moment, every sensation. It had felt so real, so right. But now, in the sterile solitude of my own apartment, doubt began to creep in. Was it just a moment? A product of proximity and late-night loneliness? A week of forced intimacy in the strange, liminal spaces of the building? Maybe it didn't mean anything to him. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he already regretted it. The silence from him was deafening. My phone remained dark on the kitchen counter, a black mirror reflecting my own anxious face. The morning came, gray and unwelcome. I watched the sunrise from my window, the same sunrise I had watched with him on the roof just a few nights ago. It felt like a lifetime ago. The city woke up, the streets below filling with cars and people, all moving with a purpose I suddenly lacked. My entire world had been focused on midnight to 4. Now that it was over, I was adrift. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety. I tried to sketch, but my hands were unsteady. The lines were all wrong. I couldn't capture anything. My mind was a loop of his face, his voice, the feel of his lips on mine. I was terrified. I had laid myself bare, admitted I didn't want it to be over. And what if he did? What if that quiet "see you" was just a polite dismissal? By the time evening fell, I had worked myself into a state of near panic. I considered going down to the stairwell, just to see. But the thought of sitting there, waiting, felt pathetic. I thought about going down to the lobby, trying to catch him as he started his shift, but that felt desperate. I was frozen by indecision and fear. I had been brave for a single moment, and now my courage had completely deserted me. I was back to being the passive observer, trapped in my glass box in the sky. Midnight came and went. I was sitting on my sofa, staring at the door, my stomach in knots. I had missed my chance. He was down there now, starting his rounds, walking the silent corridors alone. The week was just a weird interlude, and now everything was back to normal. The loneliness I felt was sharper, more acute than ever before, because now I knew what its absence felt like. Then, at a little after 4 in the morning, just as I was finally giving up hope, there was a knock on my door. It was a soft, hesitant knock, not the sharp rap of a delivery person or the confident knock of a neighbor. My heart leaped into my throat. It couldn't be. He should be finishing his shift, heading home. Why would he be here? I walked to the door on shaky legs. I looked through the peephole, and my breath caught in my chest. It was him, Alex. He was standing in the hallway, out of his uniform, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked younger, more real. He was just a man, standing outside my door. His shoulders were slumped slightly. He looked as nervous and uncertain as I felt. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture I'd never seen him make before. I opened the door. We just stood there for a moment, staring at each other. The hallway was silent. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Hi," he said, his voice quiet, a little rough. "Hi," I breathed. "My shift ended," he said, stating the obvious. I was on my way out. He gestured vaguely down the hall. "But I came up here instead." "Why?" The question was barely a whisper. I needed to hear it. I needed the reassurance. He looked down at his feet for a second, then met my eyes again. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "You weren't in the stairwell," he said. I checked. Relief. It was a tidal wave, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. It wasn't a mistake. He had looked for me. He had come to me. The simple statement held everything I needed to know. It meant he had been thinking about me, too. It meant last night wasn't just a fluke. I started, but I didn't know what to say. My internal monologue, which had been screaming at me for hours, was suddenly silent. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice still low. "Or is this a bad time?" "No." "Yes. Come in," I stammered, stepping back and pulling the door open wider. He walked into my apartment, and it felt like a momentous occasion. He was crossing a threshold, leaving the world of service corridors and security monitors and entering my world. He stopped in the middle of my living room, looking around. His presence seemed to fill the space, but not in an intimidating way. He made the room feel less empty. "Nice place," he said, his eyes taking in the minimalist furniture, the large, empty canvases leaning against one wall. "It's clean." I let out a shaky laugh. "It's sterile," I corrected him. "It's a waiting room." He turned to look at me. "What are you waiting for?" he asked, his question gentle but probing. I looked at him, standing there in the soft light of my apartment, looking tired and real and overwhelmingly present. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think maybe I was waiting for you." The internal test was over. My fear, my doubt, it all evaporated in the face of his presence, his quiet reassurance. He had come to my door. He had sought me out. Now it was my turn to be brave again, to be an active participant. A slow smile spread across his face. The same warm, genuine smile I'd seen in the maintenance corridor. It reached his eyes this time, making them crinkle at the corners. "Yeah," he said softly. "Me too." He took a step towards me, and this time there was no hesitation. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers were warm and strong as they laced through mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate gesture like the kiss had been. It was calm. It was certain. It was a promise. "I don't know what this is, Julian," he said, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Me neither," I admitted, my voice steady for the first time in 24 hours. "But I'd like to figure it out." "Good," he said. "That's good." We stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, in the quiet of my apartment. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden glow through the massive windows. The light spilled across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the same sunrise, but it looked completely different. It looked like a beginning. "Coffee?" I asked, a sense of domesticity settling over me that was both foreign and deeply comforting. "I'd love some," he said, "but only if it's better than the sludge I have to drink at work." I led him into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter while I moved around, grinding beans, filling the machine with water. The simple, familiar actions felt profound with him there, watching me. The silence was easy now, filled with a quiet understanding. He didn't let go of my hand, so I made the coffee one-handed. It was clumsy, but I didn't care. As the coffee brewed, filling the apartment with its rich, warm scent, I looked at him. He was watching my face, his expression soft. The stoic, unreadable security guard was gone. In his place was Alex. Just Alex. And he was here, in my kitchen, at dawn. I realized the building no longer felt like a cold, impersonal structure. It had secrets, yes, but they weren't just leaking pipes and faulty wiring. The building's biggest secret was that it had brought me to him. My little sanctuary in the stairwell had been a beacon, and he had been the one to see the light. He reached out with his free hand and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against my temple. It was a simple touch, a quiet intimacy that spoke more than words ever could. It said, "I see you. You are real. We are real." I leaned into his touch, a sense of peace settling deep in my bones. I was no longer an observer of my own life. I was no longer a ghost haunting the forgotten corners. For the first time in a very long time, in this sterile apartment that had never felt like a home, I felt like I had finally, truly, arrived.